Today, I'm going to be showing you guys how to produce a track in the style of Transparent Soul by Willow. Willow is one of those artists that is constantly being produced by Travis Barker, who's actually got a great production ear for this kind of like modern pop rock style. We're going to be going over a bunch of guitar layers, how to make the same guitar part different section to section using different amp tones, and how to make newer drum samples sound older and vintage using tape saturation. But before we get into any of that, let me introduce myself. Hi, my name is Seth. I work as a guitar-based pop producer, and I do one of these videos every Thursday to show people how to produce their own pop music at home. Songs I've either produced or written have been featured on the Spotify curated playlist, and I did an entire album through Warner Music Group. So if after watching this video, we seem like a good fit for each other, check out the top link in the description. All right, now let's jump into it. All right, so the first part we're gonna be jumping into are these electrics right here, which sound like this. I wanted to replicate that sort of lower riff in Transparent Soul that's kind of on a dirty, clean channel. It's the one that's really responsible for all the chord information in terms of the guitars, so I wanted to have this sort of pedaling movement, if that makes any sense. Obviously, it's double-tracked. For the tone, I'm actually using the Gojira plugin from Neural DSP on one of their cleaner amp settings. It looks like I took this Ishan preset, the rhythm one, and I tweaked it a little bit. With this tone specifically, I didn't want it to be super drivey. I wanted it to be kind of clean, but not hyper-crystal. It doesn't pluck out on top of the mix as much. So yeah, basically I just threw it into an EQ, high passed it, and then low passed it to make sure I was getting rid of all of that excess high end, which in a song like this where we are layering a bunch of guitars together, making sure each patch that you're using is dialed in to work with the mix is super important. Low end and high end and sort of the lower mid range, those frequencies can build up really quickly when you're using aggressive guitar tones. But yeah, like I said, everything is double tracked. And then most of the sound of this track was actually due to this guy. So this is Verb Suite Classic from Slate Digital. And I just found a room preset that I really liked. Used a little bit of Soothe to make sure it wasn't getting too crazy and put those guys on Ascend. And a lot of the elements are going to that reverb. The reason why I want to do this is because with this style of song, it's really important for it to feel like a live band, like in an actual practice space. And in my opinion, one of the easiest ways to tie a mix like this together is to put a room reverb on Ascend and just kind of send everything to it a little bit. Obviously, when you get to certain elements like the kick drum or the bass, you need to tone it back a bit more. But yeah, those are these guys. We then have another electric part that sounds like this. I think another note I should make real quick is that when I was recording all these parts, I was actually using this guitar. This is one of the Sterlings that I have here. And the reason I know this is because I've actually replaced the pickups with the Marzio deactivators. The reason why a lot of these DIs really translated well across multiple different guitar rig patches is because I got some really nice pickups in that guitar. And specifically, those pickups are more high output and are sort of suited for this style. So if you were to do any one thing to increase the quality of your pop rock productions, it would be to replace the stock pickups in your guitars. But anyway, from a writing standpoint, these guys are playing sort of higher up on the neck. Again, they're pedaling a little bit, but it's a slightly different rhythm from these guys up here. If I solo the two of them, you can hear that they kind of play off of each other a little bit. They kind of feel like they're weaving in and out of each other. In terms of a tone, I'm using this ultrasonic preset, which for those of you who don't know is a replica of a Dumble. Just kind of tweak the gain a little bit. Again, double tracked. But then something that I decided to do that I thought was kind of cool was when it goes to this next section, which is the drop, I used the exact same guitar part, like these DIs are literally the same. And I actually used the same guitar amp preset, but I dialed up the gain for this specific section. I really wanted to replicate the sound of somebody playing in a live band on this slightly clean tone and then turning on a distortion pedal or a drive channel on the amp for the chorus. So here, I'll show you what that sounds like. I feel like layering your tones like this is a great way to sort of dynamically make a part work section to section without necessarily writing a new part. For processing, I just have both of these guys going into a bus, doing some EQ. Again, since we're doing a higher lead part, we don't need as much low end or low mids. And a note about this is when you're EQing your guitars, you really can't just copy and paste an EQ like this onto a different part, because the place where you need this high pass filter and this sort of low mid cut is going to change dependent on the specific specific part that you're playing. But after that, I ran into this vibe strip on Slate Virtual Mix Rack called Guitars. Really, I just wanted to kind of level it out and tame some of the weird stuff happening. It kind of levels it out. A lot of that is being handled by this compressor here. And then I really high passed it up here. Like there's barely any low end coming through on this because it's a lead. And now we're going to look at these two guys, which are, I'm going to be honest, I normally try to write these guys in a similar style to the song that I'm doing. But with this one, I basically just had to take the exact same part and play it because I couldn't write anything else similar. So again, this is meant to be sort of like the lead line, but it's not meant to have the same role as this other lead, but it's not really meant to have the same role as this other lead line up here. This guy is more of like a pedaling tone that's playing off of this main rhythm part, and it's just sort of extending that chord information, whereas I feel like this is more of an actual lead part. This is rendered out in stereo because I just wanted to tune it real quick, so I threw on Metatune from Slate, and then just printed that tuning into the DI, and then threw it in here. A big piece of advice that I would give to beginning producers who are running on lower spec computers is if you have to throw some kind of tuning solution on something like this, get it dialed into how you like it, then print it down. Because having a lot of instances of auto-tune, it's like the most CPU intensive kind of plugin you can have. So I would highly recommend printing it down. And that's what I did here. So for the tone, I grabbed this sort of hot solo lead, which is based off of a Saldano. I think it had a tube screamer on by default, but I turned that off. Again, pretty drivey, pretty hairy. You can see on the EQ, actually, I didn't do that kind of like low mid cut that I did here because that low mid information actually helps this lead stand out apart from this other lead. Also making sure that this lead is kind of an octave up from this guy. So if you want to think about it this way, you have the part here, which is sort of lower. You have this part that's sort of like an octave up range from that. And then you have this guy, which is an octave above that. Another thing that I did to sort of beef this lead up because it wasn't standing out in the mix the way that I thought it should was after tracking it up here in this range, I duplicated this track and then pitched the DI down an octave. So it has this sort of lower layer here. And then I just sort of blended it underneath that other lead so that they both stood out in the mix. For mixing, I threw on the guitar channel strip again, tweaked it a little bit. I didn't want to high pass it as much as that other lead because I wanted there to be some beef on this sort of like singing part. And then I used H delay in the ping pong mode on an 1/8 delay just to make it sort of wide in the stereo field. The next parts we have to talk about are these guys, which come in during the chorus. So we have this guy here, which is kind of an inversion of these guys up here. Like if you listen to it, they both are in the same key, but this one is just kind of in a higher voicing. So here's the first one. And this guy here. So it basically took this sort of driven vibe of these leads here and just sort of extended it for the chorus. Again, didn't really have to do a whole lot here. This one was a little bit more on the scooped side, just because this is a really hairy part and I didn't really want it to stand out in the mix too much. That's why there's a lot of reverb on it. So this is basically the same Saldano lead sound, but it's really overdriven. Going into the same guitar vibe strip, and then we're running it into some ROM reverb because I really wanted it to be wide and sort of dreamy, if that makes any sense. And then the last guitars we have are these guys. A way you can think about the way I arrange these guitars is I have a sort of lesser part or quieter part for the verses and then sort of a drivier part for the chorus. So these guys are kind of like a drivier version of these sort of cleaner, plucky guys. But I ended up putting both of them in the chorus just because it sounded nicer. But yeah, we've got these guys. They're using kind of the same rhythm sound. And again, basically took the same patch that those other guys were on, turned the gain up a bit. I think I adjusted the distortion pedal on here to be a bit more drivey, and then played something that was a little bit more chunky and slappy. So here's what all the guitars sound like together. They sound kind of hairy and fuzzy, but at the same time, that is kind of the sound of Willow. A lot of her guitar tones are not these super clean, poppy Marshall tones. They're very grungy and they're very hairy. So I ended up throwing Soothe on the guitar bus just because things were getting a little out of hand. And it just sort of tames that like 4 to 3K range that can be super annoying on driven electric guitars. After that, we have the bass. So for this, I used my Music Man because it had that lower range. I'm using the Parallax plugin from Neural DSP on this Dave Otero Punch preset. I think it's really great for an overdriven bass that you don't want insanely distorted. Like you're not looking for a metalcore Django bass sound, but something that has a decent amount of distortion, almost like a Sans amp. And then we have this, which is Virtual Mix Track for the bass, doing a lot of saturation and stuff like that because I really wanted to make sure that I was hitting those sort of lower harmonics of the bass. And from a songwriting perspective, you can hear it's kind of like sloppy and stuff like that. Normally I would be a lot gear about my takes, but this is kind of like a grungier track. Yeah, honestly, not a whole lot going on with this guy. For anyone who's watched my channel before, you know that I normally do a ton of processing on the bass. I'm normally using Bass Rider from Waves. I'm normally using some kind of sidechain compression. I'm normally using some kind of like EQ fundamental subtractive thing with Soothe. But with this track, it really felt like a classic grunge track to me. And so I tried doing it as simple as I possibly could. And now we are looking at the drum, which sound like this. Again, normally I would be doubling this kit up with a bunch of different samples and a bunch of different layers and stuff, but for this track, I wanted to keep it as grungy and not overly processed as possible. So I ended up using the Tony Royster Jr. kit from Mixwave, which ended up working really well. I used the default kit with no boost, because with a lot of older punk stuff, you actually don't want that sort of low-end boost. Like, you don't want it to sound like a modern drum kit, if that makes any sense. So even though this kit sounds amazing, I actually did a lot to destroy it after the fact. I'm sorry, Taylor, but it just worked for the song. So as you can see, doing some high passing, not as high as everything else, and then subtracting a decent amount of the low mids. And then I recently started using Kramer Pi again. I used to use this a lot when I was doing metal stuff, but I recently reinstalled it and I forgot how much I loved it. So it's a really heavy-handed compressor. You can hear it right here. If I turn it off. On. Off. A large part of this tone is coming from this Kramer master tape, and again, you guys know I love the 7.5 IP to sort of dull up the high end in a natural way, and this is probably the best example I have for like how that works. So, when I turn it off, like you can hear like the spit and everything coming out, which normally is fine. I love that, but with this one I wanted to dull up the high end, so when I turn it on, it just kind of dulls everything up. And then I use this drum crush preset just to do some mixing after the fact. I didn't really want to compress it too much because we were already compressing it. This is basically just to level it out a tiny bit after the fact. But yeah, that is essentially it. This is honestly a pretty simple track arrangement. And then for my mastering chain, again, this was a super grungy track and I didn't want to do all of the modern mastering processing that I would normally do. Normally I'm going crazy with like mid-side EQ and high passing the sides up to a certain point. With this one, I wanted to see how far I could push that sort of analog band sound. So for my master, I actually used like the stock Ableton EQ. I threw on the Slate Glue preset, which instead of doing the normal transparent compression that I'm used to using on my mastering chain, it's just kind of like a classic mastering compression. Again, threw the Kramer tape on here just for some harmonic saturation. I didn't lower the IPS speed because I wanted to actually retain some of the high end on the master. Some weird frequencies were building up, and so I used a linear phase multiband. And then instead of using my normal limiter, I thought I would just have some fun and use some FG master. And then on the end, I used tonal balance from Isotope just to make sure that everything was hitting exactly where I wanted it to. I used this rock preset. And yeah, that's what the whole track sounds like. So I will show you guys what the whole thing ended up sounding like. And yeah, that's what the track sounds like. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit subscribe and do all that stuff, and below you already know what it is. Again, I make one of these videos every Thursday, so if this is the kind of stuff that you enjoy learning about, I would suggest subscribing, because I'm doing one of these videos every Thursday. Also, if you have any other pop songs that you know of that are guitar based that you would love to see a breakdown of, put them in the comments down below. I would love to do them. If you want to check out the video I did last week, click on this video and see how I did a breakdown of the Kid Leroy's 1,000 Miles to show you how to do trap based guitar stuff. But other than that, I'll see you guys next week.